Well, just the other day, Dr. Mark Burke and I were talking about the threat of a fuel price increase that was going to hit South Africa's economy in such a way as that it might just kill all the green shoots that we are seeing of a recovery. He was motivating very aggressively for a 3.17 Rand a litre reduction or subsidy from government. And today we hear 3 Rand is coming through. We'll find out how much of his motivation was listened to. Thank you, Mark. Last time we spoke, you were in Parliament. You were about to go and give some questions to the minister. Has he been listening to your lobbying?
I think he has had to listen to both the DA's pressure as well as a larger South African society calling out for help. And there's a part of me that thinks the ANC is unable to take good faith suggestions from the DA just on face value. And so we asked for 3.17 Rand and he went for 3 Rand instead. It's still a lot of suffering that's about to take hold in South Africa tomorrow. I wish that government could do more, and we'll have to keep finding ways as the governing coalition to do more. But under the circumstances, we'll give them the change on the 3.17 Rand to the 3 Rand. And I'm sure there will be many people trying to claim victory for this slight reduction in the pain about to hit our economy. But the main thing is that we've been able to alleviate some of that pain. So just to be clear, the fuel price is going up tomorrow by more than 6, or is going to go up by more than 6 Rand, and will now be closer to 3 Rand a litre of petrol. And of course, the diesel will be quite a bit higher still, but at least 3 Rand relief on both sides.
The problem, though, is that this is the average price for the month. And if you take the current price, we've got another big fuel price increase coming next month. So what are you looking at to try and reduce that shock? Because if all other things being equal, it's almost like it'll be a delayed reaction.
Yes, so just for the layperson out there, the way the fuel price is calculated in South Africa is almost on this catch-up basis. So there's movement in the price per barrel of crude, and then there's movement in the foreign currency, and then once a month we say, well, that movement has resulted in this change in the fuel price, or as frequently as once a month. It doesn't, of course, always move in that way. And so what you're now describing is if the price per barrel keeps going up and the rand keeps weakening, then in a month from now, we'll be looking at yet another base price increase. I think it's a valid question. I think anybody telling you they can predict what will happen in the Middle East and by implication what will happen to the global supply of oil is probably being a bit adventurous in the analysis. Nobody can tell you what will happen there. But what I feel one could say with a measure of confidence, although always applying a healthy amount of skepticism there, is that this is likely more of a short-term to medium-term shock to the global economy than a permanent shock to the global economy. And I say that only because, at some point, if sources of fuel from that part of the world and Iran specifically is not viable anymore, then the way enterprise works is it tries to find ways around it over the medium to long term. And so I'm hopeful that, we're not looking at a forever shock here, but that it is more short to medium term in its nature. And then back to your question now is what happens by next month? Well, the fact is, of the total fuel price per litre, perhaps petrol is simplest to explain. About 6.32 Rand goes towards the state coffers and the various levies that get charged, be that the general fuel levy and the road accident fund levy. And 3 Rand of that has now been offered up for a month and potentially 2 months thereafter, as of today from the minister's announcement, which obviously means there's another 3 Rand to go if absolutely needed. And we'll have to then monitor and see what the base price of fuel does. I'll also point out that what the DA proposed and what the ANC within a margin of error of 5% today announced, our 3.17 Rand reduction was actually a 50% reduction in the 2 levies, the road accident fund and the general fuel levy, which is global best practice. Australia has done it over the weekend. Namibia did it at the end of last week. And many other countries are taking measures to try and insulate their economies. So we've taken a measure that's comparable to what's being done elsewhere in the world to try and absorb some of the shock on behalf of South Africans. And we say we have been the government. And that's good. It's good that the ANC listened on this occasion. It sucks that they took so long, as they often do, and ran it down to the wire. But and of course, it doesn't resolve the pain for South Africans, but also the pain for people all over the world at the moment.
Do you have any idea how it's going to be funded? Because that's the real story here. 6.5 billion rand a month subsidy effectively, which is now coming through. As you've explained, it's going to be coming from the fuel levy, and it'll be coming presumably from the road accident fund as well. So is that not bringing into account what you were looking at, which was the compensation fund and the SETAs, where there does appear to be quite a lot of fat?
Yeah, so the best way to try and understand this is these fuel levies combined, the R6.32 or 35 odd that go towards the levies, is almost, if you were a business and you're thinking about your income statement, that's the revenue side that flows to the state at the pump. And then there's the expense side, which is what does that levy then get spent on? Now, the general fuel levy just goes straight into the fiscus, and then that funds things like policing and education and so on. And the road accident fund component moves from the pump, where it's extracted on the revenue side, into the fiscus and straight on then to the road accident fund. And those two things combined make up about 140 to 150 billion rand in a year. And backwards from that, you can calculate at their full price what that means month on month. And as you now said, in the order of 6.5 billion, if you were to slash both by 50%, is now foregone. And the question then is, if you assume that you still need to fund both those revenue items because there's matching expenditure, which is the case for the road accident fund, and is also the case for all of our other expenditure, then you almost have to ask yourself in the immediate term, how do you substitute those two forms of revenue that you've now stripped out? And what we've proposed here is 4 pots of money, saying there's many more if government were to become a lot more responsible. And so the first and biggest one is the compensation fund. It's an entity that exists to provide people who lose work and their livelihood a form of compensation, and if needed, pensions. It's a very overcapitalized entity. It's a poorly run entity. It's an entity that's the subject of adverse audit findings. And it's an entity that, between its interest income as well as its contributions annually, far exceed its liabilities or its claims, if you will. And so it doesn't need the surpluses that it keeps accumulating there that contributes to its net asset basis. And what it doesn't actually need to be applying and succeeding in retaining these sizable surpluses. Just in the last year on their statements, they indicated 21.7 billion rand. So I could then go on about what we need to do with ghost workers, and I could go on about the SETAs that the president has said should be wound down. But maybe to conceptually explain it to the business tribe as follows. We've now won the first stage of this battle, which is not extracting this revenue at the pump from South Africans. The second stage of this battle is to not increase taxes elsewhere or increase our debt, but in fact to tap the sources of money that we've identified through Treasury. And it has to be said, it's wild that we, with our small team, has to come up with these proposals constantly. You would imagine the Treasury's large staff cohort and, the ANC minister would have been championing these sorts of efficiencies. But we will have to be firm now that this cannot come from more tax or more debt, and it has to come from something akin to these basis of funding. And we need to actually do a whole assessment of the balance sheet of South Africa Incorporated and see where pots of money are sitting idle, probably ripe for looting, and say we need to cut back at those and move it over to the fiscus so that we can shield South Africans and provide more efficient state-run services to people.
Yeah, you're certainly not letting this crisis be wasted. But if you look forward to, say, 3-6 months, now there's some very dire forecasts about what the unpredictable Donald Trump might do. He's threatened this morning, our time, overnight US time, to take out all of the oil producing installations that the Iranians have, in addition to desalination plants. And it just sounds like it could get really bad. And if that were to occur, one would anticipate a even higher oil price. And as a consequence of that, even more potential pain for consumers in this country, because that's really what we care about, is what's happening here in South Africa. Are you suggesting then that it's not the end of the road on the fuel taxes, that there are other pots around that a decisive government would be able to find to at least see South Africans over this hump?
Absolutely, and we all intuitively know this. When we see these massive tenders being paid out for pseudo hospitals to be built during COVID, and it never happens, we, at a deep level, I think we all realize that government is deeply corrupt and inefficient, and that we should be a prosperous country. We should be a place that's able to tap into the resources for the benefit of South Africans, and we've lost track of that at times, but it doesn't need to be that way. So absolutely, to answer the question, we've just in this short exercise, we've articulated how we can fund the two levies being slashed by 50% for up to 6 months, and we came up with those suggestions within a week. So it's a political will challenge. It's absolutely an ANC lie to believe that if we don't bring in excess revenue, and the average South African that pays taxes pays between 8 to 12 forms of taxes, between value-added tax and personal income tax and the fuel levies and rates and charges, and the list just goes on. And it's an absolute ANC lie to say, well, we have to increase those amounts, put all of them at global limits. I mean, personal income tax in South Africa is at Scandinavian levels, and it kicks in a lot sooner than Scandinavian countries. So it's an absolute lie to say to people, well, no, those have to increase, otherwise frontline services like policing and education and health will suffer. Yeah, we need to have the political will to become more efficient. We need to tap into things like CETAs. I mean, the surplus there is 6.7 billion according to their latest statements, and that's just for the last year. But the running cost of the 20 plus CETAs that are, again, poorly run, subject to adverse audit findings, the SIU is investigating them, that the running cost of that is close to 20 billion rand a year. And we've been saying for a while that these CETAs, which are these training authorities, could be amalgamated and scrapped in a very short space of time. And likewise, our ghost worker audit, it's at the moment it's run at the national and the provincial level on a personal system, the personnel salary system. But that ghost worker audit can be expanded to the local government level, the more than 250 municipalities we have, and as importantly to the state-owned entities level, the more than 700 state-owned entities we have. I mean, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but we've got some entities that exist. One of them is called the Kalahari Kid Corporation. I can't tell you what it does, but it has a board of directors, and so long story short, Alec, if the political will existed to start cutting back at all of these patronage pots, there's more than enough to fund. And then if we were decisive enough to make our procurement more efficient, and we said, no, we're not going to be paying for outdated ideologies. We will procure on a value basis. We will only pay for things that add value. And by the way, the money that we are collecting and we are spending on things like healthcare and policing and education would be a lot more bang for buck. It wouldn't be, up to R1 trillion that's circulated between 100 beneficiaries of the outdated policy of BE. So we have the ability to fix these things, but it doesn't look like doing it the way the ANC has done it for 31 years. It looks very different to that. It looks like running this country like a business.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps that quip about not wasting a good crisis is quite relevant here, because when you're in a crisis, suddenly the political will does become more possible. And we might have that right now. Getting back to the current situation, though. So we've got a 6.5 billion rand subsidy, in inverted commas, that is going to be assisting South African motorists. We're still going to be paying more for petrol and a lot more for diesel, but that is a result of what's happening globally. What happens if you discover that the increase or the subsidy is not being funded in the way that it should be, i.e. reduced taxes or tax take, but that it will be funded through debt, which already South Africa has a big problem with? What can you do as the DA? We know you were pretty effective with VAT and you've been effective here as well, but what can you do in that instance?
Well, just to touch on the sizable debt burden for a moment. When I was a young student in my early 20s, our debt to GDP, which was just a fancy way of saying how much does the economy produce and what portion of that, uh, if you took all of your economic output and you applied it to the debt that's outstanding, how long would you sacrifice all your economic output to get rid of your debt? It's an economic term, this debt to GDP ratio was in the mid-20s. I remember reading comparative studies at the time and thinking, oh, it's interesting. South Africa, compared to OECD countries, has quite a manageable debt burden. And then you had the Zuma years and you had debt binges, and now our debt is at 77% of our GDP. Now, to try and that, if everybody's sacrificed all the money they make and all the economic output in the country, if FlySaf Air and Toyota and everybody else just handed over whatever revenue they accumulate, they'd have to do that for 9 months before we would have been able to pay off our national debt. That's a horrifyingly high amount of debt. But to make that more tangible for people, out of every 100 rand that your listeners and viewers pay towards tax at the moment, 22 rand is going towards servicing our debt or paying off the credit card bill. And then every year Treasury increases. They've now stabilized it this year before this latest shock. But every year up to this point, they've increased our debt burden, which just means the credit card bill gets bigger, even though you're trying to service these interest payments. All of that to say that our debt burden is suffocating us as a nation. It's crowding out critical spending in other areas. We cannot afford to take on more debt. And I don't want to go on too much of a tangent here, but likewise, we've got a real problem that the state keeps underwriting guarantees. It's the new form of taking debt. So it says, if Transnet or Eskom needs this, the state will guarantee that the funder that the state will make them whole. And it doesn't actually go onto our books in the way that the new debt would have gone onto our books. So the problem seems to be compounding. Now back to your question, Alec, which is what can we do if they try and tap debt to field this relief that's being given at the pumps? It's unacceptable. It cannot happen. We cannot increase taxes and we cannot increase debt because it is crowding out critical spending. The way that you deal with budgets in a coalition is you discuss it with each other. You listen to good faith suggestions. And then, of course, it has to be voted on in Parliament. And the ANC has 39% of the seats in Parliament. And so if they propose in upcoming budget cycles to just keep bringing budgets to Parliament that increase our debt burden or try and increase the taxes, we will have to deal with it as firmly as we have dealt with the VAT issue, as firmly as we have dealt with this levy issue. And we're not doing that to try and be obstinate. But at some point, you become an enabler. If somebody keeps racking up debt with no plan to pay it off and it is ruining the household, dad just keeps going on these spending binges and kids can't afford to get to school. So we'll have to be firm on it. There's no space in our fiscal management to start thinking about incurring more debt. It will be as painful, if not more painful to the nation than increasing our taxes, which is equally unpalatable to us.
A bit of tough love for interesting the point that you make there about government being surety or standing surety, and it's fine while the those that you stand surety for are paying. But then we saw what happened with Eskom. Government stood surety and eventually ended up giving us a 250 billion rand debt as taxpayers because Eskom wasted money. Just to close off with, when you look forward on the political realities of the ANC actually following those very sensible proposals that you put on the table of the compensation fund, the SETAs, and the ghost workers, TARS, I think you call it, is there a time that a partner, the biggest partner in the government of national unity, can actually say, hang on, we got to do this in the national interest? Are you seeing any sense that could overcome the political negativity, perhaps, of doing something that was initiated elsewhere?
Yeah, if I understood your question correctly, I think you're asking whether the ANC will at some point start listening to good faith suggestions. Is that
pretty much, or just listening to common sense, to rationality, rather than saying, no, it comes from this particular person, I'm not hearing it?
Yeah. It's unfortunate that it's progressed to the level that, just because we're saying it, It's almost like if the DA really wants something to happen, we should pretend like we want the exact opposite, and then maybe the ANC will go for it. It is unfortunate. Having said that, they have listened to us on this occasion. More than a week ago, diesel was going to go up by almost 10 rand a litre and petrol by more than 6 rand a litre. Nobody was doing anything about it. We stepped in, we made some noise, we added pressure. And as of today, here's the announcement that's, within striking distance, as we say, from our proposal, 3 rand versus 3 rand 17. And so I think there's almost something adjacent to hope that the ANC might, on occasion, see the light and adhere. But remember, the suggestions that the DA are making in instances like this and others are not like purely ideological or like some conspiracy to try and extract some. These are good faith suggestions that we genuinely believe will help the economy and by implication help every South African. And because these are good faith suggestions, when they're implemented, as is the case with that, as is the case with the reforms that we've insisted on to get off the global grey list, as was the case with it does have an effect on the economy. It has an effect in a positive direction. And you would have to hope that there are at least a couple of smart people in the ANC that sees that says, oh, we did this thing the DA wanted, and now things are actually a bit better than they used to be. Maybe we should do more things that the DA wanted, as opposed to this petty, we can't have that because then the DA would look too strong. It just seems a bit juvenile to go the second route there. And it does seem to me that, at times they see the good faith, market-friendly reforms we're trying to implement, and they see the value of that. But in any way, we will keep insisting on them. And if we get it right more often than they get it wrong, then I think we've got a shot at this thing.
Dr. Mark Burke is the spokesman on finance for the Democratic Alliance. I'm Alec Hogg from biznews.com.